Good morning. England's cricketers have lost the Ashes after a humiliating defeat in the third test in Melbourne. Australia won by an innings and 14 runs, wrapping up the victory before lunch on the third day, making this the shortest test match completed in Australia since 1950. The hosts lead the series 3-0 and will now fancy their chances of completing a series whitewash. Let's bring in our sports presenter, Eleanor Roper. And hello to you. It was interesting, wasn't it? In the last hour, we were speaking to a journalist who's out there. She's an international cricket player herself. She said it's very curious.
Yeah, I enjoyed her analysis, actually. Interesting. She was off for a drink, he said.
I think many people
If you've been up all night watching
37.
cricket, you might not want to keep listening now. Not a good morning for cricket fans, although to be expected at this point, wasn't it? The face of England captain Joe Root says it all. Australia have retained the Ashes after England were embarrassingly beaten in the third test by an innings and 14 runs. The defeat means Australia take an unassailable 3-0 lead in the 5-match series.
Well, in other news this morning, a doctors' group says it is deeply concerned by the number of COVID patients being admitted to hospital after the government said there'd be no new restrictions in England before the new year. The Doctors' Association claims current restrictions are not sufficient after the Health Secretary Sajid Javid gave New Year's Eve celebrations the green light, but urged people to remain cautious. Here's our political correspondent, Joe Pike.
The kingdom may be united, but its leaders are divided as the four nations diverge on their COVID response.
There will be no further measures before the new year. We won't be taking any further measures. Of course, people should remain cautious as we approach New Year celebrations and, take a lateral flow test if that makes sense. Celebrate outside if you can. Have some ventilation indoors if you can. Please remain cautious. And when we get into the new year, of course, we will see then whether we do need to take any further measures, but nothing more until then, at least.
Boosters are part of the reason Boris Johnson has held his nerve. COVID cases in England may have reached a record high, but hospitalisations have not, although they are on the rise.
We're just not seeing those numbers at this point that we saw in January 2021. But the view is very clear. It's still too early to tell about whether we are going to see larger numbers of older people coming in, needing that kind of care as Omicron reaches the older population. And in particular, as all of this intergenerational mixing that we've been doing over the last few days works through.
Hospitality venues face restrictions in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, including the closure of nightclubs. But they will remain open, including on New Year's Eve, in England. For many businesses, that is a relief.
We were expecting restrictions because the way the government has been, on TV and kind of scaring everybody and stuff, and the way they were talking about Omicron is going to affect. In London, we were expecting, and yet suddenly we saw that there's no restrictions.
All this has been welcomed by Conservative MPs who were rebelling just a fortnight ago.
This is excellent news for the country. It's excellent news for the hospitality industry that people can go out and enjoy New Year. And also, the underlying message is that the data that the Prime Minister and the Health Secretary are receiving from the scientists supports what we suspected, that Omicron variant is mild for the vast majority of cases. It's leading to fewer hospitalisations, far less serious illness and fewer deaths.
Boris Johnson has been criticised throughout this pandemic for moving too slowly. This time, however, his pace may have been perfect, but it is a big gamble from a man who has taken a lot of bold chances throughout his political career. And we will know within days whether this call was right and responsible or reckless. For now, a decision has been deferred, but with the numbers still high, it has not disappeared. Joe Pike, Sky News, Westminster.
Well, more now on the response from doctors, and the Doctors' Association says if the current situation is left to continue, there could be severe consequences for patients and NHS staff. In a statement, it said frontline staff are deeply concerned at the NHS being overwhelmed by the sheer number of patients requiring ward and critical care beds, along with the rising rates of staff sickness, way above what has been seen before during this pandemic. Despite the vaccine booster rollout programme, DAUK believe that current restrictions are not sufficient and are very concerned that if the current situation is simply left to continue, there could be severe consequences for both patients and NHS staff. And we are going to be speaking to Dr David Nicholl of the Doctors Association later, 7:30 this morning, so about 20 minutes. Let's get an update from across the continent now and take a look at the situation with COVID around Europe. In Germany, protests have been held in multiple towns and cities against new restrictions, which come into force nationwide today. New rules include limiting private gatherings to a maximum of 10 people, while spectators are banned from large sporting and cultural events. Nightclubs will have to close. In France, after recording over 100,000 cases daily, the government has announced restrictions will start after New Year. Big events will be limited to 2,000 people indoors and 5,000 outdoors, and working from home will be mandatory at least 3 days a week for those who can. And for the first time since the start of the pandemic, Spain's coronavirus infection rate has exceeded 1,000 cases per 100,000 people. Spain's vaccination rate is above 80%. So restrictions are low, but there is concern that immunity might be falling. More than 8,000 flights have been grounded since Christmas Eve, many because the crews came down with COVID. So what state is the travel industry currently in? And can we be certain when we're booking foreign travel that our money is safe from more COVID cancellations? Well, joining me now is Ryan Howson, founder and chief executive of the Stay Shore Travel Insurance Group. Good morning to you. Thanks a lot for joining us. It's extraordinary, isn't it, that we're at this stage now where before it was because of the pandemic, border restrictions, but now they may not be able to crew a flight.
Yeah, I mean, that's true. So obviously it's very important that customers have some type of protection in place so that they're covered for their expenses.
So how do you go about doing that?
Well, I mean, obviously, we're the market leader in the UK for travel insurance. So I think it's important that you go to a company that's been around, that's got plenty of infrastructure to be able to deal with the problems that we've got. But what we have is that as part of our insurance policy as standard, without any extra costs, that you've got COVID cover included.
The insurance industry has really adapted quite well, hasn't it? Because at the beginning of the pandemic, you simply couldn't get insurance if you were travelling, if you could travel, that would cover COVID. But now it's sort of in the package, isn't it?
Well, actually, that's not quite accurate, because very early on, being a leader, we managed to negotiate with the underwriters to make sure that customers were covered pretty much from the start of the pandemic, and we led that. And we led it in two ways: one, including COVID cover as part of the policy, but secondly, having something called an FCDO add-on. Because if you remember in the early days, well, even now you've got red list countries, and what we were doing is allowing customers to travel against government advice just in Europe, and that was something that really helped people that desperately wanted to travel within Europe. So, we led the market, but you have found that other companies have sort of caught up, and the vast majority of policies will now include some type of COVID cover. But it's incredibly important that customers do check that and make sure that they are covered for COVID.
Yeah, no, we don't have any red list countries at the moment, but when you're looking at the insurance that you want to buy, I mean, a lot of people will go to these comparison websites, and it is quite difficult, or it does take a lot of time. You have to do a lot of due diligence, don't you, to look at the fine print. So what are the key things that you should be looking out for?
Well, I mean, first of all, without knocking the comparison companies, a lot of the big companies aren't actually on there. So I think it's, there's a move at the moment with consumers going direct to the larger companies like ourselves. But, what you want to make sure is that that they're covered for, if there's a delay with the flight, if you've caught COVID within 14 days, for example, with our policy, then, you can get your money back. So it's those types of things. I think that cancellation is perhaps one of the key things to be covered for. And we've noticed that a lot of people are doing very close to the date single trips. But, I would suggest that depending upon how many times you want to travel, that an annual multi-trip for the year is probably the best way forward. But I would be going for a comprehensive policy that gives an awful lot of benefits to the consumer.
That's interesting that you'd say an annual cover, because surely in the situation that we're in now, things change so quickly. Do you think that it is still better to do that, or, as you say, comprehensive, include everything in there?
Yeah, well, the reason I say go for an annual multi-trip as opposed to a single trip is that, you know, when you take out the policy, a large proportion of the cost of the policy goes towards cancellation. And so when a consumer wants to change, we'll allow the consumer to change their date free of charge, but they will have eaten into some of the policy costs with that. Whereas with an annual multi-trip, it's you know, you're covered for the year. So, you know, you can take a single trip, and then even though you've got a free date change, you've got costs on top that you would have to cover for the cancellation that you've already had as part of the policy. And obviously none of us really know what's going to happen. And, you know, when you consider that, you know, you can get an annual multi-trip for £35, £40 as a starting point, it really is worth investing that. I mean, it's less than the cost of a PCR test.
Yeah, extraordinary, isn't it? How much it is now just to travel. Ryan, thank you so much. Thank you so much for talking to us. Have a good day.
Yeah, you too. Thank you.
Thanks. An investigation has been launched in Los Angeles after a 14-year-old girl was shot and killed when police opened fire in a department store. Valentina Orellana Peralta, who was shopping for clothes for her quinceañera coming-of-age ceremony, was hit by a stray bullet while hiding in a changing room as officers fired at a suspect. A civil rights group has described the police's actions as indefensible. A warning. This report from Charlotte Lomas shows the moments before and after the shooting.
Hey, get distance. Hey, back up. We have a victim down. Victim down.
This body cam footage released by Los Angeles police shows officers responding to reports of an assault at a clothing store on the 23rd of December. The officers are clearly on edge.
You got it? You got it? Yeah. Okay. He's hitting right on the right-hand side.
At the scene, they find a woman on the floor, bleeding but alive. The 24-year-old suspect, Daniel Elena Lopez, is at the end of the aisle. The officers open fire. 3 shots are fired with devastating consequences. Lopez is fatally wounded, but one of the bullets passes through into the changing room and hits a 14-year-old girl, an innocent victim who was in the cubicle with her mother. She was pronounced dead at the scene. Mourners left tributes for the young girl, while the chief of police in Los Angeles described the incident as devastating and traumatic. But the force has questions to answer. LAPD officers have shot 38 people, 18 of them fatally in 2021, a big increase from the 7 killed in 2020. The League of United Latin American Citizens, America's largest Latino civil rights organisation, has called for change, saying, "This incident is only the latest in a rash of recent LAPD shootings involving Latinos. It's apparent that the days of shoot first, ask questions second are rearing their ugly head again in one of the nation's law enforcement agencies." The California Department of Justice is investigating the shooting. The suspect, it turns out, did not have a gun, and an innocent young girl has died. Another unhappy chapter in America's history of gun violence. Charlotte Lomas, Sky News.
Well, in other news this morning, authorities in Colorado say 4 people have died in a series of shootings in Denver. 3 others, including a police officer, were injured before the lone suspect was shot and killed by police. A new report says the children's social care system is not fit for purpose and is handing some children over to criminal gangs. The Commission on Young Lives found the system can put youngsters at risk of greater harm rather than safeguarding them. It describes the care system for vulnerable teenagers as infuriatingly inadequate. And for the first time in centuries, the mummified body of the Egyptian pharaoh Amenhotep I has been seen after being digitally unwrapped with high-tech scanners. Researchers have previously been unwilling to uncover the ancient ruler's body because it's decorated wrapping with flower garlands and because of its lifelike face mask inset with colourful stones. We're going to be talking to one of the professors who was instrumental on that unwrapping. So that's really interesting, I think. Is in 9:30, around then? It is 9:30. Now, the race is on to plant trees. Countries have targets. Companies promise to plant millions. Individuals take off with seeds and shovels. But in Scotland, there's concern that many of the trees being planted are doing more harm than good for the environment because they're suffocating ancient woodland. James Matthews reports.
What trees should we plant where? It's a heated debate.
They just shouldn't be here in Scotland.
We need other types of forests.
The key thing is right trees, right place.
Trees capture carbon, no doubt. The light and shade of the discussion is over the type of tree that gets planted. Those grown to be cut down for timber tend to be non-native species. Environmental campaigners say that too often they crowd out ancient native woodland. The problem is here. This is a Scottish tree. It's been growing happily here for decades. But take a look here. These are saplings from commercially planted trees. They're growing here on this slope because seeds have blown in with the wind. Left alone, they'll outgrow the ancient woodland.
They just destroy them, basically. You know, they take away all their light and all the nutrients from the soil.
Some campaigners, like Audrey Baird, say it's bad for native species and bad for nature.
Spreading an invasive non-native species willfully across Scotland, it is totally irresponsible.
These images show green commercial species colonising or growing out of oak trees. Campaigners say pictures like these from Glen Branter Forest in Argyll and Bute are behind a petition to the Scottish Government. They want the legal protection of native woodland. Tree concerns branch into biodiversity, the animals, insects, the life of an ancient forest.
It's not just a climate crisis, we're in the midst of a biodiversity crisis too. We lose all that life, we lose our life. So protecting those ancient woodlands is absolutely paramount.
Scotland is the most wooded part of the UK, and the Scottish Government plans to increase forest coverage by 18,000 hectares a year. It points to the need to meet climate targets and to the economic benefit. So does the industry.
We've got 25,000 people working in the sector. We're contributing £1 billion to the economy. We're producing a product which is infinitely renewable. You know, you plant a tree, it grows, you harvest it and you replant it. And for our future, a low-carbon future in Scotland, to regrow our economies after the pandemic, to support the change that's going on in rural economies, for me, forestry is an absolutely crucial element of that.
In a statement, the Scottish Government's forestry agency said, protecting ancient woodland is vital and there's work ongoing to do this. There is no evidence to suggest that ancient woodlands are being lost to non-native tree regeneration in the way described. It is the great tree debate, and it cuts both ways. James Matthews, Sky News, Edinburgh.
All right, time now for the weather.
Look forward to brighter skies. The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
It'll be unsettled this week with more wind and rain, but it'll turn very mild by New Year. Before then, most places will have a mild but rather grey start, with hill fog and outbreaks of rain across much of central Britain and showers to the south. Northern Scotland will be sunnier but colder with a patchy frost. Central Britain will see the early rain largely clearing through the morning, although showery outbreaks will linger in places. Spreading to northeast Scotland, it'll stay rather dull for many there, with fog persisting over the hills. Most other places will be fine, but the south can expect some blustery showers.
The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
The Doctors Association says if the current COVID situation is left to continue in the UK with no new restrictions, there could be severe consequences for patients and NHS staff. It comes after the government said no new measures would be announced for England before the new year. Let's speak to Dr David Nicholl from the Doctors Association. He joins us this morning. Thanks a lot for talking to us this morning. Severe consequences, what are those, do you think?
Well, our biggest worry at the moment is actually staffing, and we're seeing that in terms of increased staff sickness rates. And there's simple measures which could be done. In fact, we've written to the UK Health Security Agency an open letter asking for upgrade in their outdated PPE to provide FP3 masks, which are better protection than is currently available. The kind of standard surgical mask that you're seeing on camera there wouldn't be acceptable on a German bus. You would use an FP2 mask. And, given those staff sickness rates, we are worried as we go into the new year how we're going to manage. And that is, causing a lot of stress amongst staff in all groups, not just doctors, but nursing staff as well.
OK, let's break this down. So staff sickness, this is staff in the hospitals who are actually getting COVID.
Well, for COVID and non-COVID related reasons, and that's certainly the case at the moment in London, which is very much the epicenter of the Omicron situation at the moment. And in fact, overnight, I just had an email from a colleague of mine. You were mentioning earlier about the problems in terms of pilots and less flights. Okay, got staff trying to fly back, who won't be at work next week, basically because their flights have been delayed. So this is affecting every single piece of the puzzle.
Do you have any figures on how many members of staff are isolating? I'm assuming that's what they're doing. If they've got COVID-19 or they can't come to work, if they're ill with something else. Do you have any figures of how many staff can't come to work?
I can't give that figure off the top of my head from my own trust, for example. But, we're definitely seeing that within London and elsewhere, basically. And, we were already seeing that within Birmingham, where I work, basically. It is a big issue. And we know also, in terms of ITU staff, our staffing levels are not the same as they were a year ago. And that, when we talk about bed numbers and things, it's actually, you need to understand the staff numbers as much as anything, actually.
What staff, sorry, was that? I didn't catch that.
In terms of critical care staff.
Mm-hmm. So now if you look at the staffing levels and the issues surrounding staffing levels that you have at the moment, and you compare them to, say, January this year, how do they compare?
When I speak to my colleagues in critical care, they all tell me they've got less nursing staff than they had 12 months ago.
And when you look at the data that Boris Johnson was presented with around the Omicron variant, this wasn't included, was it, the staff shortages?
No, but I think it's interesting. Each of the different parts of the UK are doing things differently, and presumably they're looking at exactly the same data sets. I think that speaks volumes.
Right. So, OK, so let's look at what he was presented with, case rates, hospitalisations, how sick people are, how long they are staying in hospital with Omicron. Do you think if there were new restrictions in England, it would have an effect on the staff shortages that you're seeing?
Well, we are where we are. These are decisions which should have been made a couple of weeks ago. And, I suppose what we in the Doctors Association are worried about our members right now. Look, there's many things we don't know about Omicron, okay? But there's things we do know, and we knew it's more transmissible. So it logically makes sense to update the PPE guidance because we know COVID is airborne, and to provide better protections for staff to reduce staff sickness rates. It's that simple.
OK. Dr David Nicholl, we're going to leave it there, but thank you for talking to us.
Thank you.
Well, also this morning, new figures show a record number of cases of asylum fraud by adults pretending to be children. Migration Watch UK says more than 1,100 people aged 18 or over claimed to be children in the year to September. I'm joined now by the chairman of Migration Watch UK, Alp Mehmet. Thanks a lot for talking to us. Good morning to you. So just explain to us how this works.
Wow, how does it work indeed? The traffickers have very quickly worked out that if you claim to be an unaccompanied minor and claim asylum, you're more likely to get it. Numbers have been going up. As we know, the Channel has seen over 28,000 people crossing the Channel illegally in dinghies this year alone. That's risen from something like 8,000. Our concern, and my concern in particular, is that we potentially have adults, frankly, they are well over 18, a lot of them, and when they are initially assessed, if it's disputed that they are adults, the immigration officials say these people are much older than that, then their case goes further on to be considered later, but pending that further assessment, they are potentially going to be placed among young people, vulnerable young people, in housing, sometimes in schools. This is clearly dangerous, and it's something that we should very quickly address.
You said numbers have been going up. Numbers of what exactly?
The number of people claiming to be children when, in fact, they're adults. In the past, in the year to September this year, something like 3,000 applications for child minor asylum. But of those that have been resolved, something like 66%, and that's over 1,118 people have been found to be adults. That is clearly not on.
But it's also the case that surely if someone is a child, you don't want to immediately assume they are an adult. So there must be some sort of a process.
Of course not. And there isn't any immediate assessment. And that's the whole point, that where there is evidence because of their appearance, their demeanour, that they are considerably older than 18, and at the moment, it's a matter of them being around 25, not just simply over 18. If they are obviously older than that, then it's taken further and there is further investigation, if you like, to assess their age, bearing in mind that just about all of them will have destroyed their documents. And there is no way, really, beyond talking to them and trying to assess what their age really is, that you just cannot be absolutely certain. And we know this, that it's risky, it's dangerous. The Parsons Green bomber in 2015 came in illegally in this way, and he claimed he was only 16. The judge at his case in 2018 said he was certain that he'd lied about his age to get into this country and to stay here. That is really where we're at, and that is why we're concerned.
Not all asylum seekers who come into this country are terrorists or
Of course not. Of course not. And we're not saying that. What we're saying is that there is a significant number where they are clearly adults and they're being treated as children and being placed among children. That is where the danger lies.
OK. Mr. Mehmet, thanks a lot for talking to us this morning.
Thank you.
Hello again, you're watching Sky News Breakfast. We're going to look at the papers now, and with us this morning to review them, the broadcaster and author Gemma Forte and the political editor for the Sunday Mirror, Nigel Nelson. Hello again to you both. Thanks a lot for hanging around. The Telegraph front page, Nigel, this does not sound good. Energy bills could treble. I don't know how anyone is going to be able to pay these.
No, that's the problem, really. And what we've got is a cost of living crisis coming down the tracks next year. So not only have we got energy bills going up, we've also got shop prices going up, a new national insurance tax to pay for social care. And, of course, pensioners will be losing their triple lock. And now we're looking at energy bills doubling and possibly, according to the industry, even trebling. So, I mean, that's going to make the annual average price around sort of £3,000 a year. Already we're paying £3.75 a week extra on the basis of the energy cap being lifted, and that's cost £100 million just between Christmas and New Year. So what the industry is asking for is a £20 billion loan to try and keep prices down. And I think that although Chancellor Rishi Sunak won't want to start giving out even more money, I'm not sure he's going to have much choice.
Gemma, what do you think? I mean, can anyone afford 2022?
No, I mean, the cost of living is going up in so many other areas as well. And I know that already people who have very, very low incomes are really concerned about this and trying already to not use the heating as much. So, yeah, it's terrible. I know Kwasi Kwarteng has been in sort of meetings, but there has to be a real sense of urgency about this. It's because of the wholesale price of gas, but it's staggering. And it also highlights, again, how reliant we are on gas. So lots of wider issues to look at going forward.
Let's look at the government and this poll on page 4 of The Guardian. It's found that Boris Johnson is, quote, a significant drag on Tory fortunes. Gemma.
That's right. A man who had such immense popularity, won that 80 seats majority, but it seems like the emperor now does look naked. The recent sleaze, the scandals, the wallpaper, Partygate, Owen Paterson, it's taken its toll. It's bruised him and the entire party. And I think people really see him as pretty toxic, if these polls are anything to go by. So the pollsters have been out. Admittedly, there's not going to be an election for a while. And in this political landscape, anything could happen and change. So, you know, it doesn't mean anything until an election happens, of course. But looking at this, they asked people if X was the leader of the Conservative Party, how would they fare, assuming that Keir Starmer is the leader of the opposition? And they looked at Sunak, they looked at Gove, and they looked at Truss. And in fact, Boris Johnson would lose 60 seats, according to these polls, so not good at all. The one who fared slightly better was Sunak, but still it had Starmer leading. Truss, interestingly enough, so she's the one who's really, really popular amongst the Conservative members, but no, not amongst the wider voting public. And Gove didn't do very well at all. So, yeah, I think there's going to be a lot of Tories sending a few chills through them and having a look. But then who's going to want to take over the mantle next year as well, when this cost of living crisis is going to take full effect as well?
Nigel, what do you think? Let's have a look at that paper again, the picture of Rishi Sunak behind Boris Johnson. Who do you think could be a real contender to the leadership?
Well, I mean, certainly the ones that Gemma has mentioned, they'll all throw their hats into the ring. And I do think Boris Johnson could well go by springtime if Tory MPs get their way. But I mean, you've also got to think of that other contenders are out there. Jeremy Hunt, the former health secretary, has not given up his leadership hopes yet, so he may well throw his hat into the ring too. Rishi Sunak is not terribly popular amongst Tory MPs. He's not very clubbable, so I'm not quite sure whether he would have support. Liz Truss obviously is going for it in a big way, but the first thing they've got to do before we even get to that point is get rid of Boris Johnson, and that's the tricky part. You need 54 MPs to put in letters for a vote of no confidence, and then that vote has to be carried by more than half of them. The danger is they get the timing wrong, because if you go for a no confidence vote and Boris Johnson wins it, he can't be challenged for another year.
OK, spring, you say, Nigel. We shall see. We shall see. Let's look at the page 2 of the Mirror. Why has the terror threat been made worse by lockdown?
Well, it's mostly because, according to Damien Hines, the security minister, you've had an awful lot of people stuck in their bedrooms on their computers. And some of those, only be a small proportion, will end up being radicalised because of it. We know that most terrorists or Islamist terrorists are radicalised online, and so with lockdowns that they have more access to that and more time to sit on their computers. Now, MI5 keeps tabs on about 3,000 people who are thought to be at risk. That's the most they can actually monitor, and yet they also know that there are at least 10 times that number who are a danger. So after COVID is over, I do think that the government has got to look seriously at how they can actually give MI5 more resources to combat this. And of course, essentially, that means more money so they can recruit more people.
Great. There's a lot of spending going on and not much money around, Nigel. 2022 is looking great. Talking of money, let's discuss the sales, the Christmas sales, because they may have had low footfall, but online, there were a lot of people shopping online, weren't there?
Yeah, that's right. And I think there's all sorts of factors going on here. Okay, so footfall was down considerably. I mean, if you compare it to 2019 Boxing Day, it was like 60% or something, so a huge fall. However, as you say, online shopping doing pretty well and booming. But I think our habits will have changed over the last couple of years anyway. I think a lot of shoppers, perhaps who didn't embrace online shopping before, have discovered it now. You know, their credit card details are in. It's all simple once you've done it the first time. Now, interesting that retail experts say as well, Boxing Day falling on a Sunday might have affected it. Apparently, traditionally, Sunday is the one day out of the week when footfall is lowest generally. I found that strange. I don't know what day it is right now, and I'm not sure that would have made much difference in my way of thinking. But certainly, I also know that leading up to Christmas, myself included, I was being particularly careful because I wanted to get to Christmas. So I think people are very aware, you know, particularly in London. I mean, the numbers are so huge. So lots of people might have been avoiding shopping for those reasons as well.
There's so many people, aren't there? Every day, oh, this person's positive, this person's positive. Oh, I got out just before Christmas Eve, so I was lucky, but so many people weren't. Nigel, you've picked the Star Page 2. This is an interesting one. We saw Swaziland change their name to Eswatini, and Turkey are now going to change their name. Why, though?
Well, the reason is they want to change the spelling of the name to Turkiye, which is what Turkey has called itself since 1923. But the reason for this is President Erdogan doesn't like the fact that every time you Google Turkey, the kind of things that come up are Christmas turkeys, or another word for failure. So what he wants to do is to try and get us Westerners to be using the new spelling. So when we do Google, we actually get the country and not the birds. So I mean, I suppose the question is if anyone else will follow suit, and whether something like the Canary Islands is the Canary Islands is also having an identity crisis.
We've got to go.